Alright guys, this is the lecture on early European exploration. This is basically going to piggyback on our blue textbooks, Patterns of Interactions, Chapter 17, Section 1, but we're going to add a little bit more to that. We got four main objectives that we're going to try to hit today. These are the four things that I want everyone to be able to do by the time this lecture is over. Objective number one, I'm going to grab my textbook here. My arm disappears, don't worry about that. Alright. Objective number one, I want everyone to be able to explain what were the motivations behind European exploration. What was it that they were trying to do? What was it that got them from a continent whose people never really ventured too far offshore, always trying to stay within sight of land, to a continent that had the first explorers that went all the way around the world via the ocean. Our second objective, I want everyone to be able to describe the steps that Portugal's our tiny little country right there on the tip of Europe, what were the steps that Portugal took to become the first European country to make it all the way to Asia by sea. Our third one, as Portugal became more and more powerful, they started to clash with some of the larger countries, I should say, in Europe, Spain being one of them. I want you to be able to describe the conflict that they had with Spain and tell me a little bit about what the Pope did to stop that conflict from going into an all-out war. Our fourth objective, this is our final one. It's a little bit more of a minor objective for now, but this is going to come in really handy as we move forward in the next units and we start talking about Japan and China. I want you to be able to identify the European countries that were the first ones to set up trading posts in Asia. That's it, four objectives. We're going to try to do this thing in less than 10 minutes. Let's go ahead and start filling that brain. Before we can really talk about European exploration, we're going to have to go back and do a little bit of review. Looking at the Indian Ocean, looking at some of the cultures, even going back to last year where Mr. McLaughlin taught you about China, Japan, and the Middle East. We're going to take a look at the Indian Ocean world. When I'm talking about the Indian Ocean world, I'm really talking about places like China, India, the Muslim world, East Africa, and Indonesia. Together we're going to consider that the Indian Ocean world for the time being. All these countries were tied together, just like Europe was tied together by the Mediterranean Sea. These countries were tied together through trade in the Indian Ocean. This trade really allowed them from the years about 1000 all the way up to 1500 to be at a whole different level than Europe was at the same time. Europe during that time period was in the middle of the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, the medieval time period. Culture was way low. Science, technology, all this stuff had kind of fallen apart, as had health, and just pretty much every aspect you could look at on how you would judge a society. Europe during this time period was absolutely falling apart. At the same time period, the Indian Ocean world was thriving. People were growing rich. They were bringing in new sciences, new technologies, new cultures from all over the world all over the Indian Ocean world that they were sharing. It was like a renaissance. We just studied the Renaissance. It was like a renaissance for the Indian Ocean world. And really, it was completely built on the back of trade. John Green talked about this in the crash course video that we just watched, but you cannot overemphasize the importance of trade in both strengthening communities, strengthening larger communities like cultures, entire worlds, bringing peace, bringing prosperity, bringing scientific advancement, and just generally improving the lifestyle of an entire group. The trade in this time period was huge, and we were taking stuff all the way from China, and it was showing up on the coasts of East Africa. And for a time period where everything is being sailed in moderately sized boats that are about the size of a classroom or two. And this is amazing stuff that you can move these materials so far. I just wanted to talk a little bit about trade. Trade. An analogy that we've got for trade is that it's a math term, that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. What that means, Bruce Lee really talked about it when he was saying that if you have 5 fingers, the 5 fingers are weak. But if you clench them together as a fist, they're very strong. The same holds true with trade. If you got a bunch of countries that are good at one thing, that's okay. But when you combine those countries, when you share the strengths of all those countries, you become far, far stronger. Imagine this is the importance of trade. This is what made the Indian Ocean world so successful, and this is one of the reasons why the Europeans wanted to get in on this trade. Well, we've established the fact now that the Indian Ocean world, China, the Spice Islands, the Muslim world, East Africa, were thriving during the 1500s. The Europeans wanted to get into it. Now, if you think back to when we were talking about the Renaissance, you will remember that Europe was not completely unaware of what was happening in the Indian Ocean world. The Venetians and the Florentines, the traders from Florence and Venice, they were trading, they were tapping in to this large trading network in the Indian Ocean. However, they had a monopoly on it. Remember, they were sailing through the Mediterranean world over to the Ottoman Empire, picking up the goods there and bringing them back to Italy. Well, once they brought back to Italy, they could sell it for enormous profits. Profit's going to be a vocab word here, man. You have to know what profit is. Profit is the money that you make extra after from buying something and then selling it. The revenue is what you sell it for. All right, so that can be a little confusing right there. All right, I'm a Venetian. I'm a sailor from Venice. I sail over to the Ottoman Empire and I buy a Chinese vase. I buy it for $1. When I bring it back to Venice, I sell it for $10. My revenue is $11. That's wrong. My revenue is $10. That's how much money I've made. But remember, I had to spend $1 to buy that. I also had to probably spend another $1 to ship it all the way back to Venice. So there's $2 that it cost me. If you take the revenue, the money that I made by selling it, subtract the cost, the $2, $1 for buying it, $1 for shipping it, my profit is $8. That's pretty good profit right there. The Venetians and the Florentines became fabulously rich doing this. Look at their cities that they built. Look at the art that they built. They built that on the back of profit from trading with the Ottomans. The Ottomans, in turn, were trading. They were tapping into the rest of the Indian Ocean trading market. So the stuff from China, from India, from East Africa. It was piping in through the Muslim world and coming up into Europe. Only through those two places, Florence and Venice, making them extremely rich and making the rest of Europe extremely jealous. So jealous that other countries said, how can we get in on this? How can we get our country to tap into that Indian Ocean goodness? Portugal was one of the first to do it. Portugal is a small country all the way on the tip of, on the western tip of Europe. It's a very small country, but it does have a decent amount of shoreline. A lot of their people made their living by being sailors, going out, fishing, going out. Well, what else do you make money on the ocean? They're fishermen, I guess. So they were pretty good at building boats and they were pretty good at sailing. However, like most Europeans at the time, they did not sail far. It was very dangerous to sail beyond the sight of land. The technology that they had at the time made it very risky to get out that far because you could get turned around and not be able to find your way back. The compass did not exist. Sails that allowed them to go into the wind did not exist. They had big square sails that meant wherever the wind blew, that's where they went, which, as you can imagine, would make them very fearful, very cautious about leaving the sight of land. This is all until the guy named Prince Henry the Navigator came out. Prince Henry wasn't necessarily a sailor. He wasn't even that high of a prince. He was just a wealthy Portuguese man. And his goal was, I am going to find a way for my country to tap into that Indian Ocean goodness. So he started a school. Prince Henry the Navigator started a sailing school. And at that sailing school, he trained mariners. Mariners is a vocab word. Mariners are people who sail. Sailors, mariners. For our purpose, that's going to be about the same thing. So he was training mariners on how to be better sailors, how to be good navigators. He was tapping into technology that he was finding in the Muslim world. Spain and Portugal had been invaded by the Muslims a century earlier, so they had some sort of relationship with the Muslim world. Using using these resources and at this school, he was able to make a whole new class of much better sailors. Sailors that were able and willing to risk it all to go out and explore. This is really one of the first countries in Europe at the time that was willing to get out there and explore. So step one, Prince Henry the Navigator gathers up a bunch of technology. He starts a sailing school in Portugal, and he trains people like Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama. And he says, go out there. We want to find a route to Indian Ocean, a route to Asia. Looking at the maps that they had, looking at the stories that they heard, they figured that the easiest way to get to Asia was to go south, to go around the tip of Africa. Problem is, they did not know where the tip of Africa was. There was no maps that went that far south. Some people even said that if you went past this certain point in Africa, right around the equator, that you were going to fall into these, not off the edge of the earth, because people at the time knew the earth was round, but they thought that there was a line at the equator that if you crossed it, you were asking for trouble. You were going to fall into storms and sea serpents and all this stuff. But Prince Henry the Navigator wasn't deterred. He found sailors that were willing to try to do it. Bartholomew Diaz being the first. Bartholomew Diaz was able to sail down the coast of Africa, hugging it pretty close, but going all the way down to the coast of Africa. Bartholomew Diaz is credited with finding the tip of Africa. When he landed there, he called it the Cape of Storms because he had been blown into it, and his sailors said, we must turn back now. But he realized that that was it, that they had found the bottom of Africa, and from that point they could round it and make their way all the way up to India, which was their end goal. After rounding the tip, his men basically mutinied on him and said, we have to go back. We're scared, we don't know where we're at, we've been gone forever, we're going back. So Bartholomew Diaz turned his boat around and made it back, but he is credited with finding the bottom of Africa, the southern tip of Africa. He goes back, he brings that knowledge to Prince Henry the Navigator's school. There, more sailors are inspired. The riches of the Indian Ocean were calling them. So a guy named Vasco da Gama mounts up his expedition, his sailors, and with the information he got from Bartholomew Diaz, he started sailing south. Made it all the way around the tip of Africa, and eventually made it all the way to India. Bartholomew Diaz credited with making it to the tip of Africa. Vasco da Gama made it all the way. That's how I remember it. Da Gama made it all the way to India. Once he made it to India, he was able to capture a small city. More Portuguese sailors followed him in the years to come, and they were able to capture tiny cities along the coast of Africa and hold them as trading outposts, making Portugal extremely rich. And in fact, some of those Portuguese territories have been held almost all the way up into our lifetimes. I believe it was like 1950 where the last Portuguese city in India was finally given back to the Indians. So if you're reading out of the Blue Book nicely summarized the reasons for European exploration into the 3 G's. The 3 G's are God, gold, and glory. It's a simplified way of looking at the reasons for European exploration. I do like it, but it's not as clear as it could be. When they're talking about gold, the European explorers, they weren't necessarily looking for actual gold, gold bars, nice bricks of yellow stuff. What they mean by gold is that the European explorers were looking to make profit. They were looking to get rich, like we were just talking about. So gold for them could be spices. Gold for them could be bringing back lumber from East Africa. Gold could be any way for them to become profitable. And there was profit to be had in that Indian Ocean trading market. Anything that you could get from there and bring back to Europe, you could sell for enormous, enormous profits. The other 2 G's, glory and God. I'm going to start with glory because that's an easy one. People like to be known. People like their names to be remembered. And this stuff was 600 years ago, and we still know Christopher Columbus. We still know, maybe not, well, now you do. Now you know Vasco da Gama and Bartholomew Diaz. Ferdinand Magellan has a big body of water named after him. There's all these people. They're famous. Glory. They were looking for their name, or for their king's name, or for even their country's name to be remembered. To be the person who claimed all this new land, or the person who brought back all this new wealth for the country. That's glory. They were looking to become famous. They were looking to bring power and prestige back to their country. The third one is God. And again, this one can be a little bit deceiving. They're not looking for God. They don't think heaven is out there over the horizon. I mean, it's an analogy. They were looking for two things. Remember, most all of these people were Christian. So they were looking for two things. One, they were looking to find native people that they could turn into Christians. They wanted more Christians. They wanted more Christians for two reasons. One, the Bible says that you should be converting people to Christianity. And two, they were looking to turn people into Christians so that they could bring them back and fight another crusade against the Muslims. They had just lost the Holy Land, the final crusade to take back Israel, to take Jerusalem for the Christians. The Muslims had kicked them out. The Muslims had sent them away. But Christians had pushed the Muslims out of Spain and Portugal. So they're kind of on a roll of beating Muslims. So these countries, Spain and Portugal being among them, they wanted to get more Christians, get them on their side, build up their armies, and keep pushing the Muslims back, take back the Holy Land. That was a fanatical Christian drive at the time. And then a less known fact, they were looking for this mythological Christian kingdom that was somewhere out in the middle of Africa. It was the kingdom of Prester John. Prester John was supposed to be a holy man who had started this Christian kingdom in the middle of Africa, and if we could get to him, he would have the secrets of how to beat the Muslims again. So it kind of boils back to a holy war. I'm just going to leave it at that for now. So God, glory, and gold were the three motivations for European exploration at the time. Simplified version, but that'll definitely get you by. So once Portugal found that sea route to Asia by going south around Africa and then back up to India, they started getting fantastically rich. Now the thing about getting rich, other people started getting jealous. Spain in particular at this time. They start seeing their little cousin Portugal right there, getting all this profit from selling all this stuff, and they want in. The problem is Portugal now has locked up that southern route. It's theirs. They built little forts along the way so that other countries can't follow suit. So Spain is looking for how can they get in on all this trade in the Indian Ocean. A guy named Christopher Columbus comes up to them and says, I got an idea. We're going to go straight west. We know the earth is round. If I sail straight west, I should be able to hit the Indian Ocean eventually. His goal was to hit the Indies, which would be modern-day Indonesia. He convinces the king and queen of Spain that this is a good plan. They give him some money. They give him 3 ships, and he starts heading west. The problem is he miscalculated the size of the earth. He thought it was much smaller than it was. So after a long, long voyage, he runs across some land. He thinks, finally, I've made it. I've made it to the East Indies, to Indonesia. Lands on an island, what is now the Dominican Republic, or it's the Dominican Republic. Sees people there, figures that they're Indians, claims that land for Spain, and then heads back. He actually does 3 more voyages, thinking that he's in the Indies, but can't quite figure out where all the riches are. Well, that's because he wasn't in the Indies. He was in the Caribbean Ocean. He was in the Americas. He discovered America without even knowing it. He goes back. He dies a very lonely man. People come after him. Spain knows they're close, so they start sending other people looking for that western route to Asia. They send Ferdinand Magellan, they send Cortez, they send all these people trying to find their way to Asia. Magellan was the first one who actually made it. He goes west, hits South America, goes south around the tip of South America, up the east coast or the west coast, and then straight across until he runs into the Philippines. He was actually killed in the Philippines because he tried to get into the middle of a war, but his sailors continued on west into the Indian Ocean, around the southern tip of Africa and back home, making Magellan's crew the first people to go all the way around, to circumnavigate, to go around the entire Earth.
There once was a man, his name was Magellan, a Portuguese skipper, the girls found him cute. He sailed with 5 ships to find the East Indies, then come back to Spain with a bounty of loot. Whoopee-tie-yi-yo, oh happy Magellan, starting your journey with hardly a care. Whoopee-tie-yi-yo, strong brave Magellan, you'll find the East Indies, you just don't know where. They crossed the Atlantic and spotted a country. Magellan said,
"It's the East Indies at last!"
But then someone shouted,
"Hey, that's Argentina!"
Magellan got cranky and chopped down the mast. Whoopee-tie-yi-yo, settle down, Magellan. Put down that axe, there's no time to despair. Whoopee-tie-yi-yo, keep trying, Magellan. You'll find the East Indies, you just don't know where. A great storm arose in the mighty Pacific. The 5 little ships were diminished to 3. At last land was sighted, Magellan was happy. But then someone shouted, "Hey, that's Chile!" Whoopee-tie-yi-yo, cheer up, Magellan. Check out your map and don't tear out your hair. Whoopee-tie-yi-yo, keep trying, Magellan. You'll find the East Indies, you just don't know where. It took them 5 months, but they crossed the Pacific. They spotted a land that was dotted with palms. Magellan proclaimed,
"Yes, that's the East Indies."
But then someone shouted,
"Hey, I think that's Guam."
"Ay, ay, ay, ay! Oops, Magellan, your fun little journey's become a nightmare. Whoopee-tie-yi-yo, keep trying, Magellan. You'll find the East Indies, you just don't know where." They sailed due west to the Philippine Islands. Magellan was pleased as the natives drew near. But then someone shouted, "I think they're attacking." Magellan said,
"What?"
and got hit by a spear. Whoopee-tie-yi-yo, farewell, Magellan. You almost made it, it's really not fair. Whoopee-tie-yi-yo, oh ghost of Magellan. The East Indies Islands were right over there.
They discovered all this new land. They claimed it all. They said this is all ours. Portugal wanted a little bit of that too, though. They had hit the coast of Brazil. So now we got 2 countries, both Catholic countries, saying that they are laying claim to a chunk of South America. So they go to the Pope. You got 2 Catholic kings. You go to the only person who outranks them is the Pope. The Pope thinks about it really hard and comes up with this crazy idea of taking the globe and cutting it in half. This is called the Treaty of Tordesillas. I'm always bad at pronouncing that. He did. He cut the globe in half. He cut the world in half and said everything to the west of this line will belong to Spain. Everything to all new lands to the east of this line will belong to Portugal. So that basically gave Portugal any new lands that are discovered in Africa and in the Indian Ocean, and Spain got everything in the New World. No one really knew who was going to get the best of this because the New World being North America and South America, hadn't been mapped yet. So I'm going to sneeze. I'm not going to sneeze. It hadn't been mapped yet, so this was kind of a gamble for Spain. But they ended up making out very, very well. They got all of Central America and the vast majority of South America. How that affects us today, if you look at a map of Central America, everyone speaks Spanish in Mexico and Guatemala. If you look at South America, most countries speak Spanish except for the big one, Brazil, which fell on that line of demarcation. It's called the line of demarcation, where Portugal owned a chunk of Brazil. To this day, 600 years later, they still speak Portuguese in Brazil. Thought I heard something. Maybe not. Alright, so the countries other European countries start getting really, really jealous of Spain and Portugal and all the riches that they're amassing by tapping into that Indian Ocean trading network. So more countries start getting in on it. England and Denmark and France all want to get some of this action. We know that the Portuguese have taken the southern route. We know that the Spanish have taken the western route. Really all that leaves for France and England is the northwest route. So they sent their sailors straight over. They run into places like New York, into places like Canada, which is part of the reason why we speak English here in the United States. And there's a big chunk of Canada on the East Coast that speaks French to this day. So people are hitting from all different angles, trying to get to Asia, trying to get to the riches of Asia and of the Indian Ocean. The Dutch also are able. The Dutch are a very small country. The Netherlands is a very small country, but if you remember from our Renaissance unit, they actually had an inordinate amount of power. They were kind of like the Venice and Florence of Northern Europe. So they were able to get over and get a hold of Indonesia and the Spice Islands. Because they're such a powerful navy, they were able to lock up that land and extract exorbitant amounts of wealth out of the Spice Islands. So when all was said and done, when it really started shaking out, European countries were all over the place. Spain had claimed the Philippines. The Dutch had claimed the East Indies, which would be like Indonesia. The British were able to get big chunks of India along with the Portuguese, and the French, even though they didn't really grab in too much. The Dutch also were able to take the southern tip of Africa away from the Portuguese. To this day, they speak Afrikaans in South Africa, which is a form of Dutch. It's just been evolving over the years. Portugal was able to get big chunks of Africa, Mozambique and Angola, and Spanish took most of South America, except for Brazil. The British took North America, and the French were able to take big chunks of Canada. So it didn't take long for Europeans to get into that Indian Ocean trade, to bring back that wealth from the Indian Ocean. For the Spanish, it was bringing back wealth from the Americas, like actual gold. Getting rich, and as they got more and more rich, they built bigger and bigger ships, and were able to kind of really muscle their way around in Asia, using their cannons, using this newly developed war techniques and technology they'd basically taken from these Asian countries, turned it around on them, and the balance of power really shifted in a hurry. Countries like India and Japan, Japan to a lesser extent, India, Japan, China, who dominated this Indian Ocean trade for hundreds and hundreds of years when Europe was down, slowly started falling out of favor as the Europeans started pushing them around. And that's where we'll be going in our upcoming units, and it will really take us through most of the year. This is a trend that has continued all the way up till until about today, in the year 2000, where now India and China are starting to kind of bring that balance of power back into their favor 500 years later. All right, that's all I got for now. One of the things I want you to dwell on as we think about this is why does this matter now? There's effects of this all around us, from the languages we speak to how important trade was then and how trade still is now. This is the time in world history where the worlds are really starting to come together. This is the time where we can actually start talking about a world history, because things that affect one part of the world are affecting us all. So with that in mind,
Você não sabe se vai ou vem. Pouco importa se o dinheiro é seu. Hey baby, seu cabelo é legal. Moda na gringa é Feliz Natal. Se equivocou, mas ficou tudo bem. Agora diz que está na onda zen. Hey baby, você venceu. Passe amanhã e pegue o que é seu. A maquiagem vai desmanchar. faz o seu medo aparecer.
So that kind of wraps up our lesson for today, our lecture for today. Let's go back really quickly and look at the objectives and make sure that you are fully prepared to answer these in the oral quiz that we'll be doing over the next couple days. Objective number 1, can you explain the motives for Europeans going out and exploring the world? What was it that pushed them out to become explorers? Can you describe the steps that Portugal took to become that first sea power to go from continental Europe and make their way all the way to Asia via a sea route? What were the steps they took to become a world power? Can you describe the rivalry between Spain and Portugal and what was done to quell that rivalry? What did the Pope do to stop an all-out war from breaking out? And can you just identify or list a few of the countries, European countries, that were able to get a toehold, that were able to get their way into trading posts in the Asian sphere? Can you name the country, and can you name the place that they were able to claim? If you can do all that, you're in really good shape, and you should be able to do fine on this quiz coming up. All right, have a good night.